of my reporting has ended up focusing on food, whether it's how we grow our food, how we produce it and package it, and how we deliver it to people's doorsteps. Now, these are all obviously different pieces of the food production cycle, and I think that the goal here today is not to necessarily equate the experiences of, different positions along this cycle, but really to look at what kind of structural problems or structural forces might underlie all of these different sectors, and how that impacts workers across all of these different places that are responsible for this incredibly essential work, putting food on people's tables. So that's what I'm going to try and use as the framework for today's discussion. And, I think at the end of the day, this is just a very human story. It's about people who, again, are doing essential work that feeds our country, and the pandemic has really exposed the cost of that. And I know it's a cost that many of you have been trying to raise awareness about for a long time. And I think this is the perfect time to be having this discussion. So I've been lucky enough to learn from a number of the people on this panel myself over the years. So I'll start off by introducing them. Syed Hassan is the Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, which is Canada's largest coalition of self-organized groups of migrant workers and grassroots organizations. We have Noe from Fuerza Migrante here as well, which is, again, a nonprofit organization comprised of migrant worker members. We have Caitlin Doucette from the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, which is helping provide emergency support to restaurant workers. And she's also a part of the Canadian Restaurant Workers Coalition. And we have Santiago Escobar, who is a national rep for UFCW Canada, which is organized both domestic and migrant workers in BC, Manitoba, and Quebec, and also works to support those farm workers who aren't able to organize in other parts of Canada. So thank you all very much for being here. And I want to start with a question to Noe, because I think, again, this is really about grounding the issues that we're talking about in a very human experience. And so my question for Noe is, what was it like for you to come to Canada as a migrant worker, and what were the biggest challenges and hardships from your perspective?
Hola, gracias por la invitación y gracias por la pregunta. Y en mi experiencia de estos últimos años como trabajador migrante, a pesar de que no estoy tanto en el programa que originalmente me trajo, mi experiencia ha sido afortunadamente bien, pero también un poco desagradable, en el sentido de que nosotros, como trabajadores migrantes regulares o legalmente traídos desde mi país, como el de varios países, siempre hay deficiencias en general. El propósito de venir aquí es mejorar la situación económica para mí y para mi familia. Pero ya estando aquí en el país trabajando, recibiendo esta oportunidad, también uno se encuentra con cosas que no son tan muy apropiadas a lo que originalmente nos dicen desde que venimos de nuestros países. En mi caso, originalmente nos dieron un contrato, y cuando uno llega y trabaja empiezan a ver estas deficiencias, que como oportunidad de trabajo es muy buena, pero ya estando aquí a veces lo principal que me fui encontrando, o los pequeños problemas, fueron principalmente por el contrato. Entonces mi experiencia es buena, pero sí también hay que ser realistas en todo este tiempo. Por ejemplo, en la cuestión de mi país, que tiene un tratado con Canadá para dar apoyo laboral, y que nosotros los agricultores podamos venir, y este programa ya tiene más de 50 años funcionando, en el caso de México y Canadá, pues en todo ese tiempo que se ha hecho un contrato desde que originalmente se hizo el contrato, nunca hasta ahorita, nunca se ha mejorado. De lo contrario, a veces creo que lo principal que yo veo es que en el contrato, que a pesar de que es para nuestro beneficio como trabajador migrante, a veces no nos toman en cuenta hasta, a pesar de estos últimos años que ha habido muchos intercambios mm, diplomáticos y han recibido muchos puntos de vista hasta ahorita, no ha habido nada significativo para los trabajadores migrantes, porque no se les ha tomado en cuenta la opinión a nosotros como trabajadores. Entonces, ahí es donde el contrato incluye, bueno, ahí el principal problema es en el contrato que solo incluye la relación de los empleadores con el gobierno mexicano en este caso, pero nosotros como trabajadores hasta ahorita no nos han preguntado si nos gusta, si hay algo que queramos mejorar o si hay algún beneficio que queramos agregar al contrato. Entonces, esa es, esa es una de las cosas de las que yo empecé a sufrir, que realmente es lo que me motivó a mejorar mi
I don't
situación.
understand it. Oh, is it just grass and stuff?
Entonces, por eso estoy aquí, porque empecé a ver que hay muchas deficiencias, no solo para mí, porque principalmente lo viví en persona, pero también, al igual que yo sé que muchos trabajadores migrantes lo están viviendo, que muchas veces el contrato es como un instructivo para los trabajadores. Dice cómo tratarnos, en qué condiciones tiene uno que trabajar, incluso en qué condiciones de salud tiene uno que venir desde su país, pero no garantiza que esas condiciones excelentes que pide el contrato, no garantiza que uno regrese a su país con esas mismas condiciones buenas. Entonces, llega uno aquí, trabaja, pero a veces los trabajadores lo ven más, el contrato lo ven como una opción de los puntos a los que han llegado el acuerdo, si los toman o no. Por ejemplo, los pagos. Hay muchos trabajadores en todos los países, en todos los estados de Canadá, donde sufren por los pagos retardados, por horas no pagadas, por de plano quincenas no pagadas, que fue en mi caso. En la última granja que yo trabajé por medio del programa México-Canadá, me tuve que salir, básicamente me tuve que dejar la granja porque no me estaban pagando desde que empecé a trabajar recuerdo que en mayo hasta agosto difícilmente pude cobrar un solo pago completo. Y son cosas que, como eso, como la vivienda, como cosas que no se cumplen, pero que a uno cuando llega del extranjero está expuesto a eso, a llegar y pide el empleador que cumpla uno con las horas de trabajo, con el reglamento de la granja, con el tiempo que uno le piden laborar, pero difícilmente ellos cumplen con su parte del contrato de hacerse responsables sobre nuestra salud, sobre nuestros pagos, sobre nuestras condiciones de vivienda, si estamos o no bien de salud. Y eso es lo que me gustaría que al final de todo esto, que gracias por la invitación, pero igual después de tantos foros que he participado en estos últimos, o en este último año, me gustaría que todo esto llegara a una aportación más física, más sincera, una aportación significativa, que esto ayude a concientizar que uno como migrante viene y trabaja, pero no garantiza que uno tenga o reciba todos los beneficios que hace un contrato, sobre todo el gobierno, que está consciente que hay un contrato y que a pesar de eso no garantiza las condiciones que estén al 100% como trabajador que viene uno del extranjero.
Thank you so much for that. And we really appreciate you sharing your experiences. And I think that you've touched on some really important points, which really show some of the inadequacies and flaws in the migrant worker program, from the inability of workers to have a voice, to wage theft, to housing concerns. And we know that these have been documented for years with little change. So my next question is for Hassan. I'm hoping you can tell us what some of the root causes of the problems that Noe has outlined for us are.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Noe. I think I want to, Noe started off his comments by saying, I came here to improve my economic conditions. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, why is it that people around the world are impoverished so that we have to come here to work in the fields, the farms, the factories, and in restaurants and in cleaning to be able to support our families back home? And when we think about the food system, Canada is one of the world's 6th largest exporter of food. And how did that happen? How did this country suddenly become this massive food exporter? And what is the impact of that? Because right now, Canada, in its massive exports of food, is actually resulting in people in Mexico, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, unable to feed their families because the products that they're bringing to the market, the Canadian product that's arriving there, is cheaper. Just as one example, pancetta, flowers, right? Like in Mexico used to be a big export. Now Canada has taken over Mexico as an exporter of these flowers, but it's Mexicans from Mexico now growing it here, right? So we can see that there's this global situation where people are being forced to come here. And that is one of the central root causes. But when we arrive here, 1 in 23 people in the country, that's 1.6 million people, don't have permanent resident status. Each year, 750,000 people are entering here on temporary status, which means that you are able to come here, live here and work here, but you can't access healthcare. You can't speak up against a bad boss. You can't complain about bad housing. You cannot protect yourselves, right? This is fundamentally a question of power in the workplace, power in housing. All of us have to assert our power to protect ourselves. But when speaking out against a boss means termination, if you're a farm worker, it means homelessness because you live in employer-provided housing. It means deportation, and it means that you will not be able to come back because you're being blacklisted. Then how do you defend yourself? And so the fundamental issue here is the lack of permanent immigration status that makes it such that people don't have agency. And it has created this two-tier system that is happening across the food chain. So we talk about the food chain, it's production, right? But it's also the truck drivers who are driving that food to the supermarkets, it's the supermarket workers, it's the cleaner in the supermarkets, it's the restaurant workers, it's the cleaners, it's the dishwashers, it's the Uber and Foodora drivers, and all across this chain, it's migrant and undocumented people, at least in large metropoles. And all across this chain, the people who are holding up the entire edifice of the economy and our society are migrant and undocumented people forced to leave our countries because of decisions made here. And then we're here and we're subsidizing this country as a result of our lack of permanent immigration status. So migrants, we had this 3-month process in which thousands of migrants participated between April, May and June. 4,000 people in Ontario. In every sector, we asked them to collectively identify a priority, and that was status for all. June 14th, we launched it. So that's what our members are telling us. It's about a single tier society where we have the power to protect ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, and you've touched on that key demand, which is status for all. And I wanted to turn to Santiago now, who I should add that UFCW's support helped ensure that this session could happen today. So thank you for that. But Santiago, I'd be curious to know what you at UFCW have been advocating for in terms of solutions to the problems we're talking about. And where is the pressure point? Where are you focusing your energies in terms of demands and asks to make change here?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. We strongly believe that every worker deserves to be treated with dignity and respect at work, no matter where they come from or their status. To build on top of what Noe and Hassan just said, in the case of agricultural workers, for almost 3 decades, UFCW has been warning about all the injustices and low labor standards that agri-food workers, local workers, is important to mention that, local workers and migrant farm workers face in Canada. A lot of challenges. We have been advocating before the provincial and federal government. As you know, in Ontario, where the majority of the migrant farm workers are, and in Alberta, agricultural workers are not allowed to join a union. So this time is now to implement meaningful changes as the pandemic has uncovered a crisis within a crisis. So we think that it's time that agricultural workers are included in the Labor Relations Act, because in order to improve the standards of agri-food workers, we claim unionization will certainly address many of their issues. Through collective bargaining, workers will have the possibility to negotiate a workplace free of harassment. We already have, examples in Quebec where we represent about 800 temporary foreign workers in agriculture. These workers will be able to get health and safety protections, better wages, basic days, basically have dignity and respect at work and improve the labor standards in agriculture, because we think that the core part of the problem is that agriculture, comparing with other industries, doesn't have, has low labor standards. Is because of, these workers have been banned to join a union. So through a collective agreement, we have even achieved permanent residency for migrant workers in meat plants that are unionized with UFCW. So we have best practices examples. We think that there is hope, and also, if you allow me, I would like to name some of the things that we have done in the last couple of months, especially now during COVID-19. So in the wake of COVID-19, UFCW started to advocate, this is back in March, more intensively for the well-being of our members in the food industry, because we are the food union. And also, of course, for all frontline workers. So thanks to this work, Loveless workers were the first to receive a $2 per hour wage increase for frontline workers across the country. Physical distancing measures and plexiglass dividers at checkouts and cashier counters were also made mandatory. These gains produced discussions in other unionized frontline workplaces such as Metro, Food Basics, Sobeys, Safeways across the country. Following these negotiations to protect frontline food workers, Cargill, Oli Meal, Maple Leaf, Pepsi Cola, all these workers achieved additional pay premiums and safety measures at their workplaces. This made it possible that non-unionized workplaces also joined these standards set by the unions and benefited from these measures. UFCW has advocated over 20 measures to be implemented to protect migrant workers, local workers, frontline workers during the pandemic, and especially in this case, frontline food workers. Just to mention some examples, we urge the employers, the federal government, provincial governments to reduce or eliminate eligibility requirements for employment insurance and sickness benefits. In the case of migrant farm workers, these workers pay into employment insurance, but they cannot collect any benefits. So, and also if they become ill or if they are laid off, they cannot get this access. So we lobby, and these workers finally, for the first time since the implementation of the temporary foreign workers program, they're finally collecting EI benefits. Also to pay all migrant and temporary foreign workers while they are in they can go for 14 days when they arrive in Canada, and they will be paid. Of course, we also have found out that some employers, I would say many employers, are not paying these workers accordingly. And the benefits that the USPW have been able to achieve, have a long list of benefits. But what I'm trying to say is that the union gives these workers a tool to exercise their labor rights and their human rights.
Yeah, and I think what you're also describing there, Santiago, is a safety net. And I'd like to ask Caitlin to share her experiences about how another part of the food production cycle has fared, especially during the pandemic, restaurant workers and the adequacy, I suppose, of the social safety net that is available to these workers, and what you've sort of heard from your colleagues in terms of their experiences, staying safe and being able to pay their bills during the pandemic.
Sorry.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Caitlin.
Do you hear me now?
Yep, there you go.
Thank you for the introduction. So for restaurant workers, I mean, the crisis, like many of my colleagues have just touched on in the speaking panel, has exposed a lot of frailties and a lot of failures of this industry kind of in the best of times. So a lot of the workers are, our kind of advocacy focus is to really put this message out there that restaurant workers are precarious workers in the best of moments. They're not workers that often have a lot of financial safety net. They're not a lot of workers that really often come from
No, I'm good, thanks.
ancestral wealth or things like that. They're also workers that face a lot of systemic barriers. So in terms of adequacy, I think things like the CERB program are really quick to mobilize at a government level. However, are these adequate long-term solutions? No. We're looking more kind of in terms of really adaptive strategies for longevity for these workers, to create platforms and programs where they can feel safe at work, where they can feel safe to self-advocate, because the COVID crisis has created situations where a lot of workers don't feel safe to go to work. There's a lot of mistrust between employers and workers on kind of the best of days in this industry. So I think a lot of the work that we're kind of advocating towards is to create a new conception around restaurant work. A lot of the narratives that dominate the type of work that restaurant work is kind of narratives of exceptionalism. We think of celebrity chefs, we think of food writers and things like that. That's not the everyday of a restaurant worker, and they face a lot of barriers or kind of exploitation, such as wage theft and harassment and things like that. So it's really an industry, because of its deep unregulated nature, leaves a lot of people in the cracks. And I think the COVID crisis has just kind of elevated that profile for a lot of these people.
Thank you for that. Noe, just back to you. I'm curious, from your perspective, what would make it easier or be helpful from your perspective in terms of support from the public, how people listening today could show their support for migrant workers and sort of take action on this issue? What would you like to see?
Bueno, sí, para responder esa duda me gustaría que en este caso me ayudara Alexa, que es también una voluntaria conmigo en Fuerza Migrante, así que Alexa puede decirles más sobre la pregunta.
Thank you, Noe. so just to make sure that people know who I am, my name is Alexandra now, and I've been with Fuerza Migrante since the beginning. I've been supporting migrant workers for the last 8 or 9 years. And and as Noe said, I'm also volunteer. We're all volunteers in Fuerza Migrante. So I because I'm an ally of migrant workers, I'm not a migrant worker myself. I've been learning how to support them the best way that we can. And one of the things that we've been learning and we've been hearing from the workers is that what they look for is for people to take the struggle of migrant workers seriously. And that means it's not something taken just as a school project, or is just left when things get difficult, or so is for them. What we've heard is an ally sees the workers as adults, as human beings, and offers them what the workers are asking for or expecting to receive. An ally offers support in concrete to get or to achieve concrete results. Doesn't do it out of personal interest. It does it for the collective improvement of the workers' conditions, working or living conditions in Canada. An ally does work for a positive change or result for the workers. And in this sense, it would mean allyship would contribute to the destruction of dynamics of power and oppression of the temporary foreign workers. An ally assumes the responsibility to in their role in the exploitation of workers, because we all have a part on this. We're all benefiting from the exploitation of these workers. An ally doesn't show up only when there are critical moments or emergencies happen, sometimes looking for fame or sometimes looking for protagonism, individual protagonism. An ally accompanies at the beginning, during, and until the result or a result is achieved. And again, there's always calls for consistency in the support in the time, like during long periods of time, because it's very common now that I've been a part of this organization. We see a lot of people coming to find a way to support us, but really, we have seen very, how do you say, ephemeral support. Like they will come for 1 month or 2 months, or while the summer break or something like this, but it really doesn't make any change. So if you really want to support migrant workers, you need to take it seriously, and you need to understand that you come to support the workers' struggle and for their benefit, not for your own benefit. That would be one thing that I would like to say.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hassan, I know you've been working in this area for a long time as well. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts on what effective support or allyship looks like.
And thank you so much, Alejandra. Hi, it's been a while. I think I want to pick up on this point that Alejandra said about individual protagonism. We have created or constituted this idea of allies, like be an ally with migrants, be an ally with Black people, be an ally with, X entity. And when we say that, what we're trying to say is like migrants are sort of this like hegemonic idea, right? Together, but the person who's in alliance is the person who's acting as an individual. What can I as an individual do to be an ally? And the fact of the matter is alliances are built between organizations. So when when people ask us what can we do, the first thing we say to them is like, organize yourselves, form, whether it is form a union or form a collective or form an organization. And I'm speaking here to, all the members of Food Secure Canada. How many people do you represent? How many people democratically can you move to an issue? if you need to, everybody needs to group themselves, and then we can build alliances between groups of people. It's not about an individual act. It is about collective consolidation. So for us, one of the first things that we are doing in terms of migrant farm workers, and then I'll speak about our national efforts at Ally Building. First, we said, how do we organize migrant farm workers? So currently, we have established base groups. So we established committees at individual farms where farm workers meet every week, every month, and where they ask essentially two questions. What can we do for ourselves? What do we need others to help us do? And when they say others, they mean other migrant farm workers. And so over this process, we have seen, 1,000 workers are meeting at this point, at least once a month with their co-workers to develop an organization that speaks with one voice. They elect coordinators, the cause coordinators meet, they bring proposals to their organization, and it's a democratic body. And we're trying to do the same with students and care workers, Fedora workers who are undocumented or students and others. And we're also trying to build these national alliances of similar migrant organizations. So, working with similar organizations like Forza Migrante doing similar work in BC, joining with our members in Ontario, and finding active moments where we can actually collaborate at specific points where membership is meeting with membership. So then my request is for people to also think about, what kind of organizations are we building that can actually consolidate with each other? And so when we talk about migrants are very clear about the demands, right? We went through a consultative, deep process, and migrants created a demand. And our job is now to amplify it. But we need, the entire working class to be organized. This is about workers, and the working class needs to be organized to take on the richest few, the 1%, the ones who actually run the economy. There are 4 supermarkets that control 85% of this, the food in this country. 2 meat producers who control, again, 85% of all of the exports. There's a huge consolidation of wealth and power, and we need to make alliances to save all of ourselves and to build the society we really need. So that's where I would really sort of encourage people to do, is to rethink their own processes of their organization. Thank you.
Santiago, you talked about some of the successes that UFCW has had in organizing and helping to build a stronger safety net. And I wonder whether you're feeling hopeful that some of the bigger picture structural solutions, whether it's permanent status for all or amending our labor laws to allow farm workers to organize, are you hopeful that change is on the horizon?
That's a very good question. To be honest, what we are witnessing is, that we want to believe that change, in the case of, specifically talking about agricultural workers, is possible. But so far, what we are witnessing is that instead of improving, is pretty much getting worse. So just to give you an example, during the pandemic, we have received over 2,000 complaints regarding lack of COVID protection, such as personal protective equipment. Workers cannot practice social distancing. They're living in overcrowded conditions. So every day we are receiving this kind of complaints. So the government just launched, the federal government just launched a consultation to improve housing conditions. So we welcome these initiatives, but like I said before, is about to be seen. We have workers, in the case of agricultural migrant farm workers, the federal government implemented a year ago a program is called Open Work Permits for migrant workers experiencing abuses such as physical, financial, psychological, or sexual abuse. And, to give you an example, every day we're receiving 2 or 3 calls of workers that just, they learned from a colleague or through social media, or back home, that they can obtain open work permit. So we are right now, we already have a process over 120 open work permits, and is what we have you know, submitted to the government, and each application show us that what migrant farm workers are experiencing, you know, unfortunately hasn't changed much. And also we have been contacted by migrant farm workers, so survivors of human trafficking. They were exploited for a year. They were, you know, living in inhumane housing conditions. At the end of the week, they ended up with $150, $180, because the traffickers were, you know, taking advantage and, you know, deducting a lot of items from their pay stubs. So last week, to give you an example, a group of migrant workers reached out to us because, you know, they were arrested because the police raided a place and they were growing illegal cannabis, but they didn't know that. They were misled. You know, they thought that in Canada, growing cannabis is legal. So, you know, if we are learning these injustices, these abuses, you know, is about to be seen if, you know, the ones in power will really implement meaningful changes and protections. So this is why we are permanently, you know, advocating and campaigning. So hopefully agricultural workers in Ontario and in Alberta will be able to join a union, because if they join a union, they will have a mechanism, because, you know, once they have a collective agreement, the collective agreement is a binding document. So the employer must comply with it. So it's the only way to really, you know, exercise your human rights, labor rights. And as I said before, we have set some precedents, and our end goal is to improve the labor standards within the industry. But we hope that hopefully in the near future, at some point we'll be able to achieve that these workers can, you know, agricultural workers, local workers, migrant workers, be able to join a union, because we claim that is a vehicle to improve their working, living, housing conditions. It's not, you know, I'm not saying that the union will solve all their issues, but a lot of their issues.
And we're running out of time. We're going to go to Q&A very shortly, but I'll give the last word to Caitlin and ask you, Caitlin, how you're feeling about the possibility for the change required that, you know, you've already mentioned, and whether you feel like the pandemic is maybe a turning point in how people and policymakers perceive the restaurant industry and restaurant workers.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that this is, you know, a moment of significant radicalization for this industry. I think that there has been a lot of coverage of the plights of restaurant workers during the pandemic. However, you know, from the standpoint of both organization and being on the ground a worker, I'm an unemployed worker myself, that the tides haven't necessarily turned. So I think a lot of what we are doing is education and advocacy around what a life of a restaurant worker looks like. And, you know, to touch on what Hassan had said, and as well as Alexandra, we're looking for kind of coalition building and non-ephemeral allyship. So things that have lasting power, particularly in terms of coalition building. I think in a Canadian context, we have such a strong, really radical organizations all across Canada. And that's what we hope to do with the Workers' Coalition to moving forward, is to take those ideas that workers have around, you know, fair and just and decent work, and take them to the federal level to be able to advocate for them, you know, worker-led, of course, so that we get some more firm legislation that's a little less toothless and a little less convoluted for workers to navigate, so that it becomes really practical solutions to help workers, you know, in this pandemic moment, but also beyond.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for very eloquently digging into those questions. And we'll turn it over now to those listening. You can enter your questions into the chat and I will do my best to field them all. And it looks like we have a question here. We've seen international students were part of Canada's workforce especially in food production, and that they are the ones being exploited, how can we protect these international students during this COVID-19 pandemic? And maybe I'll pass that one over to Hassan, because I know you've been doing work around international students.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, we're, as part of our strategy to organize migrants, we've also been organizing migrant students and went through a similar process around identifying with migrants themselves what their priorities are. And again, the first priority is a single tier immigration system. So if everyone in the country has the same status, you are able to walk away from a bad job, able to protect yourself. But migrant students have also, secondary concerns. I mean, similar to farm workers, where we have open work permits, decent housing. The other those are similar. So migrant students are limited to the hours that they can work. They can only work 20 hours on campus if they are at a public institution. They're not allowed to be with their families. It's very difficult to get healthcare. But one of the most significant issues that are being faced right now is that work permits are expiring. So when you graduate as an international student, you get a postgraduate work permit, and that work permit is between 2 to 3 years long. And in that period, you have to finish 12 to 24 months of work to be able to get permanent residency. So that means the employers have a lot of power. They have to write a letter saying you had this good high-wage job, so you can apply for PR. And we have, for example, international students who were being paid, and then they were returning the entire amount in cash back to the employer for a whole year while they were working in a moving company. But now those permits are expiring, and because of COVID-19, nobody was able to actually amass the job experience that they needed for PR, but their work permits are non-renewable. So basically, people are being punished for the pandemic. We know, there was a 17% unemployment rate for racialized people in August, right? That's a huge number. That's almost 1 in 5. And so a lot of students are in this crisis. So one of the key demands from migrant students is to call for their work permits to be made renewable. So what I'll do is I'll drop this petition that migrant students have created that you can sign and learn more about the issues there. So, but those are about making their work permits renewable and status for all, but there's more in there. Thank you.
There's a question about enforcement from Rose. What more can be done to hold employers accountable? And I might direct that to Caitlin, because I know wage theft and poor enforcement is a big issue in the restaurant industry, as it is in many other parts of the food production cycle.
Accountability is obviously a very complicated endeavor, particularly when it comes to this sector, because there is such a large power imbalance between workers, and I would extend owners to like members of an ownership class. So it's both in terms of, popularity, status, finances, things like that. It seems silly a bit in 2020. We need to remind people, and we continue to have these dialogues around believing survivors, but I would just extend that to the labor conditions within restaurant work. It's still very, very stigmatized for restaurant workers to come forward when they experience things. Wage theft is highly normalized in the restaurant system. Sexual harassment, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse. We're seeing some of these things kind of percolate more in dominant discourses and narratives in news media and things like that. But I would say those are really tip of the iceberg. And very often they address people who already have status. So people who are not the most marginalized within these communities of workers. So I think really accountability is within kind of the patchwork that is restaurant work, and particularly when it comes to independent restaurants, but even in a larger kind of corporate sense, to really kind of speak with your money and not support folks that seem to be taking these kind of labor issues under, not kind of responding to them in the appropriate way. I think accountability can look like a lot of things. We've seen a lot of kind of movements towards transformative and restorative justice within kind of the restaurant worker advocacy and activism circles. And I think that's kind of a generative model to moving towards solutions that are inclusive of owners and workers. I don't mean to demonize owners in the least. I think what is really exciting about restaurant work, and especially on the independent level, it can provide really interesting models that are equitable and exciting kind of these magical spaces of political reimagination. But that being said, they are also often kind of petri dishes of capitalism that enact the most brutal kind of aspects of it. So I would say in terms of accountability, it's really reaching out to workers who work in these places, these institutions, whatnot, and kind of choosing to support accordingly.
I have a question here for Santiago. How can unions help frontline food workers like grocery store workers, butchers, cashiers, warehouse, and migrant workers to protect their health and safety during COVID-19? The cases, as we know, in Toronto are on the rise, and the question asker Natalie points out that a lot of employers are not following health and safety protocols. So Santiago, what is the role of unions in helping to ensure those health and safety protections are actually being enforced?
Unionized workers have more active role when it comes to health and safety concerns at work. So having just cause protection, which is one of the biggest advantages of having a union. So all UFCW collective agreements have this important protection. It's called just cause protection. Gives workers the comfort needed to be able to bring up concerns to their employer. Meaning that, you know, if these workers cannot practice physical distancing, you know, they can approach the supervisor or management and talk about these issues. Furthermore, many unionized workplaces have what is called co-joint health and safety or workers committee or management committees, where workers can have a more active role in keeping the workplaces safe. And right now, during COVID-19, we haven't stopped organizing. On the contrary, we are organizing more workers because, you know, they know that with a union they can bring protections, especially when it comes to health and safety. And just to give you a couple of examples, we just unionized Tim Hortons stores, Indigo workers now in a couple of provinces across Canada. And I would like to talk a little bit more about the protection that you will have when workers can come together, you know, bargaining, collective bargaining, you know, is a democratic process, a participatory process. In exercising, you know, one's workplace health and safety rights, the fundamental difference that unionized workers have in a certain workplaces, you know, that they can coordinate. Imagine if in agriculture, let's say in Leamington, if workers, agricultural workers and management could sit down and talk in order to improve, you know, the housing conditions, the working conditions, I think the outcome would be different, to give you an example, right? So because with a collective agreement, the employer must comply with this. So for instance, in most of the provinces across Canada, when you have, on average, over 20 employees, it's by law that you have to implement and you have to make available the health and safety workers committee where management and employees can coordinate accordingly. So there is scope. So last intervention, I think, the opposite, but yeah, I would like to acknowledge that, you know, workers are joining UFCW, workers are getting protections, and they are able to, you know, have health and safety protections, and you know, this is very important. A workplace free of harassment. Sometimes you don't realize, but that's a big issue. But the majority of the reasons why, you know, workers want to join a union is because they don't have a workplace free of harassment. And probably second is when it comes to, you know, wages concerns, but this is very important. And in a unionized workplace, you will have this protection and a strong language against harassment. So I would like to finish by saying that there is hope. And, you know, one important tool, a very important tool, is by joining a union.
I think we have time to take one more question. I'm sorry I can't get all of your excellent questions in, but we're going to be moving into breakout rooms shortly. But I'm going to mush two questions together and ask Hassan to answer. There's one question from Kathleen about Canada reviewing its immigration policy through pilot programs and a federal review of the seasonal agricultural worker program in partnership with Mexico. And Kathleen is wondering what's happening there and can it be useful? And there's also a question from Victoria about whether there's any kind of coalition that it includes both farmers and migrant workers who are working on their farms.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the question. So in terms of the federal immigration program review, as a direct result of migrants organizing over the last 6 months, but also the last 50 years in this program, we're half a century into the ag worker program, workers speaking out has made it so that you cannot ignore the crisis that migrants have been, that has been exacerbated by COVID-19. But the federal government continues to pay largely lip service, right? So they keep announcing things they already have. The agri-food immigration program has been on the books for over 2 years, has been enforced for a year, and they keep sort of bringing it up. Now, just to give you a sense, the agri-food immigration pilot program excludes all seasonal workers, which is 60% of workers. It excludes everyone in Quebec. It demands this high English and education requirement that people don't have. And finally, it requires a letter from employers to apply for PR, which actually gives more power to employers rather than less, which is the purpose of permanent residency, right? It's about changing the power relationship. So as of now, and I say this all the time when we meet with the government, the first time Prime Minister Trudeau said the words, permanent resident status and citizenship for migrant workers was in an op-ed in 2014 in the Toronto Star. It's now been 6 years. The time for talk is over. The time for status is now. So we don't see these, we're not really seeing any significant laws that have been proposed that actually change the direction of immigration policy where it has been in the last 60 years from temporariness, which creates undocumented work, towards permanence. So there's a lot of work to do. And I encourage, in our breakout, we'll all make a call for status for all. We have to keep raising our voices. In terms of a coalition that brings together landowners, there's something called the National Farmers Union, the NFU. The NFU currently doesn't have migrant worker members, but it is trying to think about how, as an organization made up of farm owners and operators, often who are actually competing against those same big businesses who are exploiting migrant farm workers, which is partially why those big businesses are shutting out local family farms, because most of it's big businesses that are actually employing migrant farm workers. But so the NFU is trying to deal with the situation. It doesn't have migrant farm workers, but it is in alliance with our organization, which is bringing together migrant groups from across the country. And we're trying to work through the tensions and the contradictions and the challenges that such an opportunity provides. But we would love to continue this work and make it real down the road. And I know they're also part of Food Secure Canada. So there's a lot of connection and relationships to be made. Thank you.
Okay, so you're going to be moved into your breakout rooms now, and we'll see you back in 15 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Rachel here from the Food Secure Canada team. The breakout rooms are just about to close, so we'll give everyone a minute to join back into the main room, and we'll wrap up before we end this session.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, how'd it go, Santiago?
I don't know what happened. I think I left too early.
Oh, that's okay. It gives you a 16-second heads up.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Everyone should be back now in about the next 10 seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So once Sarah comes back, she can do a wrap up for us. And if you'd like, I'd like to invite you to turn your camera on. We probably spend all day in our homes not seeing a lot of people, but I think it's really encouraging to see. It was 104 people at its peak interested in being a better ally in labor and labor rights. And it's really encouraging to see all of you from everywhere. So I'll hand it over to Sarah, and Susanna, if you'd like, go ahead.
Do we have time to ask the panelists for one closing thought? Okay, I'm getting nods, yes. So I'll start again with Noe. For everyone who's taken some time to listen to this session today on how to support better working conditions for food workers, what would you like the takeaway message to be, or the one thing that you hope that listeners will take away from today?
Bueno, me gustaría, como conclusión, primero agradecer por la invitación y también enfatizar que siempre hay cosas por las cuales luchar, que siempre hay necesidades, independientemente si hay evolución, si hay más trabajo, si hay más oportunidades, siempre hay algo por qué luchar por los derechos de los migrantes, tanto agricultores como migrantes en general. Y también me gustaría, como último punto, pues que fueran invitados más en algunas sesiones futuras, que invitaran más trabajadores precisamente del sector agrícola o de alimentos o migrantes en general, y que nos compartieran sus experiencias. Al igual que yo, muchos tienen también experiencias por contar, pedimentos, opiniones, y que nos hagan saber sus necesidades. Igual agradezco a todos los grupos que están aquí y que están interesados en el tema. Gracias.
And Alex from Fuerza Migrante, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you the same question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that one thing that I would like people to go or to keep thinking about is they need to understand that this is not an isolated issue. The struggle of migrant workers is connected to many other struggles in Canada. And we need to be able to connect those dots and work collectively and in solidarity with each other. This is not an accident. The program is not an accident. The program of temporary foreign workers, it has very well thought objectives and is benefiting more some than others. And we need to find ways to balance that benefits. And to do that, we need to understand that the programs are designed, the programs of temporary foreign workers or in a specific, the seasonal agricultural workers program and the temporary foreign workers program for low wage occupations, like in the food industry too, are designed, very well designed, to give the opportunity to employers to really take advantage of the workers, right? So we need to, and that is not only the employers, it's also the whole system is designed. When you have the opportunity to talk to people from Service Canada, to Canada Revenue Agency, to employment standards, or workers' compensation, you hear these ideas of when you're advocating for the workers, they will be saying, they will be trying to tell you the workers are the ones who made the mistake or who are the responsible or who are to blame. And while the employers, you can hear very easily to say the employers don't know how to do this, they need to learn. So this is like a very particular difference that we have heard from many officers from provincial or federal agencies, and it has to do with the structural racism that we have in Canada and that we all need to work on, and to destroy this, or to change this, to destroy the power dynamics that we see in particular for the migrant workers, migrant agricultural workers. We really need to understand that we need to eliminate or to work on improving our, not to improve their racism, to improve our human relationships and to eliminate the racism in Canada, which is the basis of what is happening to migrant farm workers. Thanks.
Thank you. And Hassan, can I ask you for your final thoughts?
Thank you, Alexandra. That was great. And Noe, I think very briefly, just to build on what's being said, is we are living in a society that the richest few control everything. They control the levers of decision-making, the production, the mass exploitation of our people. And that today, as a result, none of us can say that we ate today and the person who grew that food didn't suffer, or that the person who grew that food didn't die as a result of COVID-19 just in the last few months. And if we are fundamentally opposed to such a way of life, then we need to do everything in our power to change it. And as Alexandra was saying, these issues, whether it's climate justice, gender justice, racial justice, these are all connected. And centrally, it's about fundamentally transforming the power relations, which means to remove those at the top so that those of us at the bottom, the workers, can actually live and build a society that works for us. And the invitation, therefore, to all of us is to organize ourselves towards that radical, transformative, revolutionary end every day. We take our task to do that with migrants. You take that task to do with your constituencies, and then we can build an alliance capable of doing just that. So again, thank you so much for making space for us.
Thank you. And Santiago, what is the takeaway you hope listeners come away with today?
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who participated here today and for your interest in the labor perspective, in workers' rights, and also I would like to invite you all to check the UFCW website, ufcw.ca, and sign our petition. I'm going to share it right now. We do have a petition as a part of our ongoing campaign to demand protection for agricultural workers. We think that agricultural workers and migrant farm workers are the most vulnerable workers in Canada, and therefore, together we can pressure the government, especially the provincial government in Ontario and in Alberta. It's important these workers, they don't have a choice, and they deserve to have a choice if they want to be member of a union. So I encourage everyone to sign this petition and support all workers, especially frontline workers, and advocate. From UFCW, we'll continue advocating for their rights and for their protections. And, you know, as a trade unionist, as an activist, as a migrant, remember there is a tool, it's called a union. Through a union, you will be able to achieve a collective agreement, and through a collective agreement, you will be able to exercise your human rights, your labor rights. So to me, it's a concrete tool to overcome exploitation and racism at some point, because with a union, we have a strong language to protect workers against racism and any kind of oppression. Thank you so much.
And we'll end with Caitlin and any final thoughts that you might have.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to my fellow speakers. It's been really fantastic kind of brainstorming around these concepts. I think my takeaway for everyone would be to really kind of build everyone's capacity for allyship and for action across food systems. You know, I've had really interesting exchanges, particularly in the breakout room. Hassan touched on, you know, indigenous sovereignty, bringing it back to migrant labor issues. And I think that we all are here to kind of build our capacity around allyship, particularly within the scope of food systems. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. In terms of for restaurant workers, you know, as Santiago just touched on, we do have concrete kind of initiatives coming out. So, you know, for the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, we are a mutual aid organization dedicated to helping restaurant workers through the pandemic, and through the Canadian Restaurant Workers Coalition, which will be launching imminently, we will have concrete actions to advocate and to, you know, do phone banking and petitioning and things like that to the government. So I'm really excited to meet this, you know, dynamic group of speakers and to chat with you all and to kind of build our capacities to support each other. I think one thing that allyship and advocacy has really taught me is that, you know, the sky is the limit in terms of extending our work to each other and helping and building collective solidarity, as Hassan and Alexandra had touched on particularly earlier. So I'm really excited to make these connections and hopefully build a community with all of you.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for your thoughtful comments. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out to listen.
I'd just add a final thank you to Sarah as well for fantastic moderation. Beautifully done. Thank you, everyone.